and I'm going to be talking to you today about relational database applications with Plone and sqlalchemy. The format that I'm going to go for, because we've got quite a long tutorial, is to split it in two. In the first part, I'll talk about sort of concepts, and then we'll have a break, and after the break, I'll go through and demonstrate the code and do a sort of more interactive type of thing. Okay. Well, I guess the first thing to do is to try and talk about where the components that I'm talking about fit in comparison to content mirror from Capil and rel storage. The collective.tin came about from a project for a branch of a bank in London, and we were building a workflow system. They wanted to store all of the data in something that was perceived as being safe. Though obviously we're quite confident with the ZODB in terms of data storage, in terms of being safe. It's got a long track record. It's new and different, and you don't want to always have to make your customer accept something new and different. The other requirement, which was important, was that we needed to interact with other systems. Right, so there's our sort of architecture diagram for it. Well, with something like rel storage, you do actually end up with your data stored in a relational database. They're still stored as opaque pickles, and you can't really interact with that in any way from other systems, which may not even be Python based. The advantage of going with a relational database is that anything can talk to it. You, of course, lose some of the flexibility, but then that's not always a bad thing. I guess the comparison to content mirror is that this is trying to do the opposite, whereas content mirror is pushing a copy of your site structure into a relational database. This is bringing relational tables into Plone, into your site. Now, you may well ask, and some people did, why on earth are we doing this in Plone? Well, it was a customer requirement, it was their suggestion, and also we wanted to reuse the Plone UI and workflow and all those tools, which would have taken a very long time to rebuild in something like Django. Mind map. Right, there are some drawbacks to this approach, obviously. The fact that you have another system in there means that there's always more things to go wrong. We don't have the concept of invalidations from that the ZODB has, and to be honest, we didn't get to the point of testing this to any great load. It was a high-value, low-volume system. We still use the Z catalog, so you still have the potential problems of conflict errors there. And really, I don't see any way to avoid that yet, because so much of the plone UI depends on catalog queries for rendering. Right. So, first thing I'm going to do is talk through each of the major parts and tell you how they fit in. sqlalchemy is the base of this system, and it is a very powerful and flexible object relational mapper. It gives you the ability to really map arbitrary relational structures into objects. And this, for my project, was a real necessity, because the database was being used by other systems as well, and I couldn't just dictate the layout. Now, sqlalchemy has a number of concepts within it. Obviously, it has a concept of tables, which on the relational layer, and these are mapped to models, which can be any class, and grouped together in metadata. The actual interaction with the database happens on the engine level, which you then interact with through a session. Fortunately, all the code tends to end up looking fairly simple, and with the late in the 0.4 series, the declarative extension has meant that you can define at least the table and models in the same class, so that you're not managing lots and lots of separate pieces of code. To integrate into Zope, we need to work with Zope with ZODB's transaction machinery. That's done through a layer called zope.sqlalchemy, which came out of my experience with this project. It's actually fairly minimal, and it's possible to use it with plain WSGI applications, for instance. So if you use Chris Madonna's repos.tm2 package, for instance, you can actually have transparent transactions in a WSGI application. I believe this has now been picked up by TurboGears 2.
It has.
So hopefully we're sort of spreading the love of Zope technology far and wide. When I first wrote collective.tin, I based it on collective.led, which was written by Martin for his book, I think. sqlalchemy actually changed quite a lot between 0.3 and 0.4, and as that evolved, it became clearer that the abstractions in collective.led were not quite on the same level anymore as to match up with sqlalchemy well. I'm currently using z3c.saconfig for configuration for database configuration management. This is most of the work on this has been done by Martijn Fassan of Grok, and Malta has also added ZCML support for it, so that you can actually just put your database config in one line of ZCML. Obviously, it would be nice in the future to be able to have a control panel to configure all of this, but it shouldn't be too hard, and if someone wants to write one, I'll certainly give them a hand. Is there anything else there? Right. Collective.tin has a number of components. I wanted to try and support as much of the ZOP of the normal plone features as I could. We needed workflow and also versioning. The way that this is done is, well, in the root of every hierarchy, we map a table onto a folder, and onto the contents of a table folder, it's called. And this is the one ZOP object that lives in your ZODB. The rest of the objects are actually contained only in the database, so of course they are catalogued too. And this means that if you want to, you can throw away your ZODB and recreate it, and all of your content, or at least this content, will still exist in the database and will be recatalogued. The table folders contain tables or levels of subfolders and tables. So the idea is you can traverse across foreign keys down more and more levels. It didn't seem useful to me to try and imitate the freedom of being able to add content anywhere that you get with with plone and the ZODB, because what I was building was a very structured application, and I didn't want users to be able to freely add content anywhere on the site. It probably would be possible to support something like that, but obviously that would need to be added. The architecture tries to be very pluggable, so that various strategies can be taken for to support versioning and traversing across foreign keys. We support various keying strategies, from just having a string as a primary key in a table, through integers, through to composite foreign keys, composite primary keys. The versioning support is completely separate to CMF additions, which is based on fairly low levels ZODB features. It wasn't possible to reuse any of the implementation there for this. The way I support versioning is to have an intermediate table between the content itself, which which every edit triggers a new row, and then one table with the individual keys. We support workflow, either none, storing it on a single attribute as a representation of the dictionary, or as a separate table, which is probably the most useful implementation. The system is based entirely on Zope schema, and the form supports are the form support is currently written in formlib. This works okay, but formlib is not perfect, and I would like to look at using z3c.form and possibly dexterity to have a more powerful form implementation. The actual interaction between the forms and the objects themselves is mediated by factories in the case of add forms and controllers, which I intend to be something similar for edit forms. This allows the same forms to be the same form implementation to be used across versioned and non-versioned content. There's also support for vocabularies driven from tables, which is often useful for picking a foreign key field, for instance. Now, the other piece of well, actually, I stole this from Kapil because he had cooler code than me, and the idea of collective.mercury was to actually take an existing database and push out as much code, as much sort of boilerplate code as I could through reflecting the tables. This is currently out of sync with collective.tin, which I've been doing some work on over the past few days to move everything over to z3c.saconfig and tidy things up a bit in preparation for this talk. But it may be that we can use some of the concepts there and possibly combine them with dexterity's technology to actually be able to reflect database tables into content types in plone without having to write any code on the file system. That certainly would make for the easiest usage model. Right. Yes, the various relations the various models that I support in collective.tin are obviously single tables, which are by far the simplest way of modeling something, and then containment across foreign keys with simple one-to-many relations, and also versioning. Now, I was hoping that I'd be able to have some time to do some simpler examples, but instead I'm going to pick some out from the horrendous database map that I have here. Now, you'll notice here that all of these tables are following a naming specification which was outside of my control. So there is flexibility, at least in the workflow table support, to allow for prefixing all names. Right, so if we first look at a simple table, obviously there's not much to see, but it's possible to reflect in a simple table as a folder, and just it keyed on the primary keys. When you want to introduce versioning, you end up with two tables per type. One contains only the primary keys and the current version ID. Though on here you've also got extra columns to try and prompt reindexing and note when something is deleted without actually removing it from the database itself. The data then is stored on rows on a version table, and every edit triggers the insert of a new row rather than an update. Workflow is also supported across tables, and these are linked off of the primary intermediate table, I call it as well. The structure of the workflows table is simply a mapping from the values in the workflow dictionary onto the table structure. Okay, over the next couple of days at the sprint, I'm going to spend some time working on this product with the idea of moving over to some of the new technologies that other people have developed over the last few months. Primarily, the primary aim of that is to make it as simple as possible to get these content types into your plone, and with as little code as possible. So if anyone wants to sprint on that with me, please come and see me at some point. Right. Okay. I'll do a quick demo, at least, of the fairly complex system. Which probably shouldn't have the company's name on, but never mind. It's in the cache somewhere. Right. This system was designed to. It's essentially a workflow system for the processing of trades in the back office of a bank. We store information on individual securities that are traded. These can be edited by administrators who then, before anything is used, there is a fairly strict workflow that managers have to approve before anything can happen. The main objects here are counterparties, securities, and trades, and these also have various sub-objects which you can edit as well, which are over the foreign key relations. So we can add new objects through plone and workflow them all. It was actually quite simple to build most of these workflows with DC workflow. It's more powerful than it may appear in plone, where we tend to use it for fairly simple workflows. But it also supports multiple workflows per type, and it's possible to then have variables and changing variables on other workflows to trigger sub-workflows off, which gets important when you're building very complex workflows. Now I probably need to approve these before I can actually do anything. The curse of the demo, nothing ever works. We also found that when the workflows got fairly complex, we needed some way of providing help to the users. Though, and to sort of really put the workflow at the forefront. I believe this is actually very similar to how CPS used to work some years ago, but I think for workflow-heavy applications, it is certainly worth writing a portlet which adds help for users as they go through the system. Right, I think that's probably all I can show now before I go through some code after the break. So, does anyone have any questions before we stop for a bit? Yeah.
About this versioning, do you clean up the data also if you have too many versions already, or do you just leave them constantly there, the older versions?
This is a question about versioning and what happens with the older versions. Currently, there's no support for cleaning up older versions, as we wanted to keep all data. It would be possible to just write a database script to go through and do that without any plane interaction at all. Yep.
How is performance compared to storing items in subcommittee and reading them from equal?
It felt fairly performant on our test system with a local database. I think a lot of that performance benefit, though, was from the from using the simpler form-lib forms than the archetypes form machinery. Because we still use the catalog, I don't think it's going to be hugely faster than an equivalent content type in ZODB. Yep.
You mentioned a couple of versions of sqlalchemy. You said there's a lot of difference between 1.3 and 1.4.
I went for 0.4 on this system, and I've now ported over it to 0.5, which is currently in release candidate.
Lawrence, can you repeat that question?
Oh, sorry. That was a question about which version of sqlalchemy was being used, and I went for. So it's now using 0.5 RC1. Anyone else? Great. In that case, we can break for lunch for 15 minutes. Or break for a break for 15 minutes, and I shall go through the actual examples after that. Half of the tutorial is talk through a much simpler system that I've been building up over the last few days for testing collector.tin. You'll all be pleased to know that it does now have some tests. Right. I'll also admit that I currently have a bug in this implementation in that the keys, the subfolders are not restricting their keys properly. This wasn't a problem in the earlier version, but I couldn't fix it this morning. I'm a just-in-time conference speaker. Or perhaps a not-in-time conference speaker. Right. Okay. There's also another problem with add forms and KSS, which is giving me some problem. It's not actually. I think it's a bug in KSS, but I've had to start the process in the foreground, not in the foreground, so I don't get a PDB prompt. Right. So if I log in and show you what it's building. Great. You may want to give me 5 minutes to get this working. Possibly. I think it might have been blanked because I'm. Okay, so at the top level here, the only two things I have are these two folders: users, which is a folder. Well, it's only content. It's not linked in with Membrane or anything to provide authentication. And I've got a projects folder, which is intended to contain projects, which in turn contain timesheets, which are related to the users as well. So if we quickly add a test user 1, Right. So here's my user. For these, I do actually support renaming of content through changing the primary key. You may want to just control what fields you show on the form, whether you think that's something you want or not. So let's go back to the users and show that. Right, so this is, do you want it a bit larger, or can you see that? Mm-hmm. I'm not sure I can change the background easily, but I should be able to change the size. Oh, got some colours. Does anyone know what the white one's called?
Mac Classic works.
Mac Classic. There we go. Is that clearer?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I've changed this example now to use the declarative extension, which means that you configure your table and your model in one go. Because declarative relies on a meta-class, and meta-classes don't always mix well, I've had to create a new meta-class which mixes in extension class from Zope. So that's why, for this to work, you have to use this extension class. Fortunately, it all seems to work, and it's fairly simple. Now, the sqlalchemy part of it is actually really simple and nice. I think the declarative extension is really well done, and it's very easy to use. You give your class a table name attribute and set your columns as attributes on the class. This one, we just got two columns and have specified the primary key. Now, because this all has to work in plone and Zope 2 and CMF, we need to do the portal type, meta type stuff, and for formlib, we do a schema separately. I don't at the moment have any way of, as sqlalchemy exists now, I don't have a way of creating a interface automatically from the declarative stuff, but because you often need to put extra information such as a description and a title on those types, I'm not sure how much of a problem that really is. So if I switch over to the interfaces, you'll see that it's just a very simple Zope.schema interface, which if you've used plone.app.content should look familiar. Now, in order to register fewer forms, I've made the base classes for the user. I've made the base classes for the collector.tin forms look up the content type based on iContent type. So this is what this ZCML statement does. It says that this content type is, this interface is a content type. So you mark this once rather than also on edit and display forms and specify and creating individual add and edit forms for every type. As with every SOAP object, it seems I need to do the 5 register class. And sadly, for the moment, I do have to register a factory that matches up with an add view for every single content type, because there's no way to do that in a generic manner. This is why I'm looking into Dexterity and possibly Grok for trying to automate this part of the setup, so that you don't have to write reams of ZCML. I've managed to cut it down about 50% since last week, so we're getting there slowly. Right, the other part you need to do, and it's a separate type, is the user folder object. Now, this is the single object that contains your table type. I mark it here as having a string item key. There are other interfaces I can use there as well, such as integer item key, and there are some composite ones as well, because obviously you address things through strings in a URL, and you need to convert them to the right type. I'm also marking that this one should actually just remove the object from the database when you delete it with this behavior. Perhaps that should be the default. The one piece of information I need to supply is the item class, because this is used to find the correct to find the correct mapper in sqlalchemy. You need to then create the factory objects as well. The vocabulary I'll go over in a minute. So really, it's not many lines of code per type. There are unfortunately many more lines of code in the configuration in the standard GS export of the type as well. So you can create this all through the web, but I find it easier to cut and paste it all. The testing works with structure, so there's some files you can't see here because they're dot objects and dot properties inside. This means that it actually creates a bit the basic structure in the setup profile as well. So back to the model. All right, actually, the one other thing. In the setup profile, I've got a create tables function which creates all of the tables in the database. It also drops them all here as well because it's for the tests. This means you don't need to, you don't have to issue the SQL yourself. It does all the. You can use sqlalchemy's inbuilt functions to create your schema. It's not obligatory though. You can just make it match up with the schema that exists there already, and it really was one of the primary purposes of this, to make it possible to work with pre-existing schemas in the database and not assume that you own the database as well. I also rebuild the catalog after the import because it seems that things aren't cataloged correctly from a structure import. Right, so moving back to the code again, you've seen that our two columns here are represented in both the sqlalchemy declarative syntax and also in the interfaces as well. Some of this information is not really required, but you may want to put a max length on which meets up with your database specification. If we move down now to a slightly more complex type, we'll start off with the folder and work upwards. This is simply this is again a very simple table. I tell it that this table has string item keys and it's of the project class. The other thing I need to do is set the scoped session name. This is just at the top because you might want to have multiple applications within your same Zope site, your same plone site, which refer to different databases and configurations. The configuration for what the engine actually does is here in these two HTML statements, mapping the name to a sqlalchemy URL. This at the moment just creates a users.db in the root of my build out. I've had to actually use a file rather than the memory database because the version of SQLite I have installed locally was forgetting schema changes, so this seemed to fix things. If I upgraded to 3.6, it might well fix that. In real life, obviously, you're probably going to use Postgre or MySQL or something else. You have to register both an engine and a session. I decided in the end it was easier to try and match up as much as possible with the existing sqlalchemy concepts and not try and do anything too magically. There's the possibility here because they are just utilities to create a control panel in the future. Right, so if I now go and create a add one more user first. And add a timesheet. Now, I probably don't want to fill in one of these because it's auto-generated. It probably makes no sense having that on the interface, which this form is generated from. This is a choice field, which is driven from a vocabulary. The vocabulary looks up on the table, and this is defined in here and registered as a utility in ZCML. This is again the standard way of doing vocabularies with Zope schema, though I have my own vocabulary implementation. The timesheet interface uses a schema.choice and looks up a vocabulary utility of that name. Right, so this is the timesheet is a slightly more complex type. The sqlalchemy uses serial types, auto incrementing types by default for primary keys. So you will just get a serial there. We set the user ID and project name as foreign keys, and these also have to. We also have to set relations between the two objects, which we need to do after after I've created all of the types. So if I go to here, you'll see you'll get an auto-incrementing primary key. Now, this actually you'll see now the bug which is I introduced in the last week. Well, you may not see it, but because the catalog is cataloging things in the right place, you are not seeing the fact that you can traverse over these as well. Oh. Well, I have a bug somewhere. My test is actually showing that the list of items in here is including 1 and 2. The idea is that you shouldn't have to write anything, or you should have to write as little as possible which is specific to collective.tin over and above the standard sqlalchemy declarative syntax. In the project, we have a subfolder. This is both an item and also contains another table within it. You'll see on this one that I have an integer item key, and again the interfaces are very simple, are very similar. Could people put their hands up if you've created generic setup profiles before? Is that something you're familiar with? Or particularly the other way around, would it be helpful for me to go through what you need to do to a generic setup profile as well? No. I'll leave that then. The one thing that is worth saying is that you want to restrict types so that you can only add your projects within a project folder. Now, it's possible to actually create more than one table folder within your site, and perhaps in the future it will be a good way to, it will be one way of having placeless content. But the Zope side of things has no idea that that piece of content then exists in two places. So the cataloging only happens in the first place it's seen, or when you create a new folder. I can demonstrate this if. Now, don't do this, because if you do, your catalog will get out of sync, and your users will get very confused. I mean, if someone wants to work on a way of signaling plone that an individual object does exist in two places, then it would be great. It would be great to be able to catalog it in two places, I think, because there are. It seems fairly often to me that you want certain trees of content to exist in more than one place in your site. And if anyone has any bright ideas for how to make this work, then I'd be very interested. Yep.
So you're saying you have two objects in your ZODB for two different folders, but they map back to a single table in the database?
Yep.
Okay.
Exactly. Right. Right. Okay. I'm going to switch to the other project to show some of the versioning and workflow tables. But before I do that, does anyone have any questions on stuff here that I can answer? When I wrote this, we were using collective.led, so we have our mapper set up here. Now, what we have here are two relations. There's a workflow state table, and the object table, and also there's a foreign key here as well. But the I shall find one. Right, so on this one, which is not using the declarative syntax, I have some information for workflow, for how to look up the workflow storage. This is in the table workflow history interface, and you do this by giving the ID or the workflow ID column name, along with some support for having prefixes if you require it, but most importantly the table name. And there's also a way of mapping from column names that you have in the database to what you might want to have in ZOP itself, in your plone workflow. This one is also supporting versioned objects, and this works through the concept of an intermediary table, which links to the current version of your data. I have to tell it the intermediary information for versions are set on the parent. So because the containing folder needs to know how to look up its items, you give it the fact that it's a versioned table as well. Here I'm setting the intermediary class on the item class as well, and I need to implement a versioned item container. And in this case, because it's it's also contained itself, say that it's a versioned item. The other thing of note here is that having container key and item key indicates to it to include its parent keys in its lookup as well. So if you go to counterparty A, subobject B, then the keys for the subobject table will be AB rather than just B. So it composes more than just the current step introvert, the current key into the lookup on the table. This particular object also implements the iKeyTool interface, which allows you to arbitrarily change how to compose how to compose the mapping between the key in the name in the URL and the primary key the primary key in the database. So this is its primary key. You'll see that this one's still using the old style of collector.led and just using looking up a collector.led database here instead. The other feature I've put in here is the ability to push updates into Plone from other systems that change your database. I do this through having a reindex column, which, if you set it to true, it will trigger. If you set it to true, it will trigger the reindexing of that particular column. And setting true as the default of the reindex column means that if another system is adding objects into that table as well, when either a cron job or probably the simplest thing is a clock server section in your ZOP config calls the reindex view, it selects all of the objects for all of the rows for reindexing and brings them into your and indexes them in plone. This means you can actually use the plone interface onto content which is onto tables which are not really generated by plone interactions, but you can then browse through them. Right. The one advantage of having all of your one advantage of having all of your data in the database is that it's very easy to get novice developers to then write templates which just query the database, because they're generally much more familiar with writing SQL statements. So we had a number of views which just queried a database and then turned that into tables to present to the user. Right. I've just had a 4-minute warning, I think. Are there any questions people have that I can answer, or you're more than welcome to come up to me afterwards and I can go into it in a bit more detail? Yeah.
I don't know sqlalchemy at all, but my very vague, uninformed understanding was that it would generate SQL for you. Is that?
It will do that. It will do that too. You can use its syntax for creating SQL statements. I mean, there's two separate parts here. One is you can either use its ORM and not have to write any SQL at all and just do object operations. But if you're trying to present tabular data, it seems it's generally easier to map that to a SQL statement. You can use the SQL. You can use its support for generating SQL statements too. That works really well, but then you have to explain to someone who might already know SQL what to write. You have the option to do it whichever way is easiest. Yep.
I may have missed it, but have you tried this with Oracle, or will it work with Oracle?
It will work with Oracle. We at least managed to get we managed to get part of this database into Oracle. The project ended up being cancelled after that, but CDOs and trading CDOs suddenly did not seem like a very good thing to be doing, so they canned us. But I've tested it with Postgres, Oracle, and MS SQL Server, and it seems to work fine with all three. Though obviously you have to. Sometimes you need to adapt code a little bit to suit each one. Yep.
By using the declarative syntax of sqlalchemy, you can't use can declare your attribute as a field property of your interface. So when you say that your object implements this interface, if you have set up some rules into the Zoom interface, this rule will never check, because your field is not initialize with the method field property of your
In that case, you'd want to use the standard mapper setup configuration, which I use. Well, it's the way I did. I created this first before, because the declarative extension is still fairly new.
What do you think of the idea to use a broker to set the base class of your business class? In other words, the problem with such approach is that you link your implementation with the fact that your objects are stored in SQL through sqlalchemy. If you write a broker that broke your business class with, in some case, base class based on sqlalchemy, and in common case, a simple item class or simple content, I don't remember the right word for a class, a generic class of plone that store natively in a time to the DB. By using this kind of approach, you have a way to distribute your product, your with, if you want, for pure plone, or in other case for SQL.
So the idea is that I should use different base classes to have the same code work with both ZODB and relational databases. I can see the advantage of doing that. I'm not sure Grok directly is the best way to do it. What I'm going to look at over the sprint is using dexterity and the plone.supermodel XML configs to be able to use its model descriptions and have that and generate the mappers on the fly from that, which should mean that it would just be a matter of changing the base class in the dexterity factory type information. I mean, personally, I tend to build applications for a particular customer, so I would never sort of have a requirement to do something to have something which works in both ZODB and relational and in an RDBMS. You get very different features in each one, and so in some ways, if you limit yourself to that, you're getting the worst of both worlds. So I don't know how useful it is to be able to do that, though I would certainly be able to have, if we can use the dexterity's much more friendly way of defining a type, it would be very helpful to have that work with RDBMS content too. Anyone else? Great. Well, thank you all for listening. Sorry I was not too prepared. It has some tests now anyway instead. Thank you.